On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the stillness over Oahu shattered. Out of a clear sky, the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared across the Pacific horizon, sunlight flashing off their wings. Dive bombers screamed downward in tight formation, their engines shrieking like predators. Below, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay anchored, unsuspecting. In an instant, battleships became infernos. The USS Arizona erupted in a single, cataclysmic blast, a pillar of smoke rising hundreds of feet into the air. Sailors leapt from burning decks into oil-slicked waters, as machine gun fire rattled from above. Contrails laced the morning sky, mingling with columns of black smoke that spread like a funeral shroud over Pearl Harbor. In Tokyo, news of the strike reached military headquarters. Officers congratulated themselves on what they believed was a decisive blow. The Japanese press exulted that America's industrial giant was crippled before it could awaken. Propaganda outlets derided U.S. steel and machinery as crude and soulless, weapons of a society too soft, too materialistic to endure hardship. Japan's leaders believed they had gained the time needed to secure an empire stretching across Asia and the Pacific. Yet even as flames consumed the Pacific Fleet, a different fire was being kindled across the United States. Radio broadcasts interrupted Sunday routines with urgent bulletins. Families huddled around crackling receivers, listening in disbelief as casualty lists grew. The shock was immediate, but it did not paralyze. Instead, it hardened into fury and resolve. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. His voice, calm yet searing, carried across the nation. It was a date which will live in infamy. Within minutes, Congress voted almost unanimously for war. Across the country, enlistment offices flooded with young men demanding to serve. Lines of volunteers stretched around city blocks. One sailor later recalled, "We had been caught off guard, but no one doubted we'd fight back." Factories that had only recently been producing automobiles, refrigerators, or typewriters now faced a new destiny. Already, the War Department and industrial planners began sketching out the scale of mobilization. America's enemies had underestimated not just its machines, but the millions of citizens ready to wield them. The Japanese high command misjudged profoundly. They believed Americans were incapable of sustained struggle, that their culture of comfort and consumer goods would wither under sacrifice. But the very traits they mocked, the mass production lines, the sprawling steelworks, the culture of mechanics and engineers, would soon become America's greatest weapon. The devastation at Pearl Harbor was undeniable. More than 2,400 Americans killed, 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, and aircraft lined up on runways reduced to smoking wreckage. Yet even amid the wreckage, survivors pulled one another from the flames. Ships' crews rigged makeshift pumps to keep vessels afloat, and repair yards began the colossal task of raising and restoring the fleet. Within months, several ships, thought lost forever, were returned to service. For Japan, December 7th was meant to mark the twilight of American power. Instead, it marked the awakening of a giant. The black smoke over Pearl Harbor, intended as a funeral pyre, became the signal fire of a new war effort. America, mocked as a nation of mechanics, was about to prove that its mechanics could build not only steel, but victory. This was the beginning of a transformation that would carry across oceans, one assembly line at a time. The Japanese had celebrated too soon. The war that had begun with smoke and ruin would end with fleets of carriers, bombers, and tanks, all born from the very industrial strength they had scorned. And so, from the ashes of Pearl Harbor, the arsenal of democracy began to rise. The attack on Pearl Harbor had left America reeling, but shock soon gave way to something far more formidable: mobilization. In December 1941, the United States possessed an army smaller than Portugal's. Its navy had been battered, its air corps scattered. Japan, flush with victory, expected disarray. Instead, Washington responded with a plan that defied precedent. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress and the nation not only with a call to arms, but with numbers that seemed impossible. He demanded the production of 50,000 aircraft per year, a figure that startled even his own military advisors. Yet within weeks, factories across the country began the transformation from peace to war. Detroit, once the beating heart of automobile production, became the arsenal of democracy. Assembly lines that had turned out Fords and Buicks now stamped armor plating for Sherman tanks and engines for long-range bombers. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, farmland gave way to a sprawling complex that stretched nearly a mile. There, B-24 Liberators rolled out in a torrent, one every 63 minutes at the plant's peak. Workers marveled that what had once been cornfields now produced the bombers that would darken European skies. Shipyards along both coasts erupted with activity. The Liberty ship program turned maritime construction into an assembly line science. At Kaiser's Yard in Richmond, California, welders and riveters broke records by launching vessels in weeks instead of months. One Liberty ship, the Robert E. Peary, was completed in just 4 days and 15 hours, a staggering achievement that shocked even seasoned naval officers. To Japan's admirals, who watched their fleet shrink battle by battle, it seemed that for every ship sunk, 2 more emerged from American docks. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, orchestrated the vast conversion. Civilian consumption fell under strict rationing. Rubber, gasoline, sugar, and even meat were regulated to ensure maximum resources flowed to the front. Posters reminded citizens that, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler, urging carpooling to save fuel. Scrap drives gathered metal from farms and cities alike, every ounce destined for tanks, shells, and ships. The transformation was not just mechanical, but deeply human. Millions of workers filled the factories. Women in bandanas and overalls became icons of the era, immortalized as Rosie the Riveter. Diaries told of farm girls leaving fields in Kansas to weld aircraft frames in Seattle, or mothers balancing night shifts at aircraft plants while raising children alone. One worker wrote simply, "Every rivet I drive is one step closer to bringing my brother home." African Americans, long pushed to the margins of industrial work, demanded their share of the war effort. Under pressure from civil rights leaders, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, prohibiting racial discrimination in defense industries. Though segregation and inequality persisted, Black workers streamed into factories and shipyards, their labor helping to fuel the tide of war. Immigrants and the elderly filled shifts that never ended. Factories ran day and night, their smokestacks staining the skies with the soot of ceaseless production. The numbers told the story of a nation transformed. By the end of 1943, American industry had produced over 85,000 tanks, 65,000 landing craft, and nearly 300,000 aircraft. These figures dwarfed anything Japan or Germany could hope to match. For every Japanese Zero that rolled off an assembly line, America produced dozens of Hellcats, Mustangs, and Flying Fortresses. The very scale of output turned strategy itself into a weapon. Japan had believed America's reliance on machines signaled weakness, that soulless steel could not stand against the spirit of warriors. But as the production lines thundered, it became clear that the machines themselves were part of America's spirit. Each tank, each bomber, each ship carried within it the labor of millions and the determination of a society united by anger, sacrifice, and resolve. By 1942, less than a year after Pearl Harbor, the nation of mechanics had begun its transformation into the arsenal of democracy. The factories that Japan had mocked were becoming battlefields in their own right. Places where victory was forged with rivets, welds, and endless shifts of human endurance. The tide of steel was only beginning to rise, and soon it would flow across oceans, island by island, until it reached the shores of Japan itself. By 1942, the forges of American industry burned hotter than ever before. The clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, and the roar of assembly lines were no longer the sounds of civilian prosperity. They were the engines of war. Tanks, jeeps, artillery, aircraft, and ships poured from factories at a pace unmatched in history. In Detroit, the same plants that once produced Chevrolets and Fords now rolled out Sherman tanks, each one a steel answer to the Axis challenge. By war's end, nearly 50,000 Shermans would be built, their silhouettes as familiar to Allied soldiers as the rifles in their hands. Aircraft production soared. At North American Aviation, engineers designed and perfected the P. B-51 Mustang, a sleek fighter that married speed with range, escorting bombers deep into enemy skies. Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress thundered into European airfields, its reputation for surviving terrible punishment becoming legend. Alongside it, the consolidated B-24 Liberator, rolling from Ford's Willow Run plant, became the most produced bomber of the war, over 18,000 built. A single plant once set the pace of entire campaigns. The seas, too, felt the weight of American steel. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts worked night and day. Liberty ships, hastily welded but reliable, slid into the water in numbers that stunned the world. Carriers, the new capital ships of modern war, were produced with astonishing speed. While Japan celebrated each American vessel sunk, replacements appeared almost immediately. One Japanese admiral reportedly remarked in despair, "For every ship we sink, 3 more rise from their docks." Japanese commanders mocked this flood of machines, dismissing it as crude mass production. They believed their warriors, steeped in the Bushido Code, could overcome numbers with spirit. A single Zero pilot, they insisted, embodied more value than a dozen American aviators. Yet battlefield reality grew harsher with every month. At Guadalcanal, Solomons, and beyond, American fighters increasingly outmatched the once feared Zero. By 1944, the Mustang and Hellcat dominated the skies. Spirit alone could not pierce armored hulls or endless squadrons. Eyewitness accounts captured both sides of the industrial war. In Detroit, workers recalled the ceaseless thunder of rivet guns echoing through cavernous hangars. One mechanic noted, "We never saw the front, but we knew our hands built its strength." Across the Pacific, Japanese sailors stared in disbelief at convoys stretching across the horizon, guarded by aircraft carriers and swarming destroyers. It seemed endless, one recalled after the war. Ships upon ships, as if the sea itself had turned American. German generals, too, observed with grim fascination. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel admitted privately that the sheer volume of American supplies in North Africa stunned him. Every tank lost by the Allies seemed replaced within days. German industry, stretched and battered by bombing, could not hope to match it. The Wehrmacht fought with skill, but American factories had changed the mathematics of war. The lesson was becoming unmistakable. Japan's reliance on spirit and sacrifice could not offset the avalanche of American production. Tanks that broke down were repaired or replaced. Aircraft lost in combat were replaced by entire new squadrons. Ships sunk in the Pacific were outmatched by fleets rising from American harbors. The Axis mocked the supposed weakness of mass production, but in truth, it was becoming a weapon more decisive than any sword, bayonet, or torpedo. By late 1943, steel had begun to overwhelm spirit. For the Japanese soldier clinging to isolated garrisons, the sound of American engines became an omen of inevitable defeat. For the American worker tightening bolts in a factory thousands of miles away, each shift carried the weight of victory. The machines born of assembly lines were not just tools of war. They were symbols of a nation's resolve. Japan's leaders had underestimated America's factories, believing them to be soulless. Instead, those engines of war carried with them the determination of millions, proving that in the modern age, steel could break even the fiercest spirit. In the summer of 1942, the tide of the Pacific War began to turn. For 6 months, the rising sun had advanced without interruption, conquering territories with a speed that stunned the world. But in June, at a remote atoll called Midway, Japan's aura of invincibility shattered. American codebreakers, working in hidden offices thousands of miles from the front, had intercepted Japan's plans. Admiral Chester Nimitz placed his few carriers in ambush. On June 4th, waves of U.S. Navy dive bombers roared down through broken cloud cover. Within minutes, Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later Hiryu, erupted in flames. 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were lost in a single day. The blow was irretrievable, one Japanese officer later admitted. For the first time, the Imperial Navy had been decisively defeated. Yet Midway was only the beginning. In August, American Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, a jungle-covered island in the Solomon chain. It was the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War. What followed was not a swift victory, but 6 months of brutal struggle. Marines dug into foxholes beneath sweltering heat and endless rain, fighting off repeated Japanese assaults. Nights echoed with the screams of banzai charges, illuminated by tracer fire arcing across the dark. At sea, the waters around Guadalcanal became a graveyard for ships. Under the pale glow of the moon, Japanese and American fleets clashed in desperate night battles. Cruisers and destroyers exchanged salvos at point-blank range. The wrecks that littered the seabed earned the waters a grim name, Iron Bottom Sound. For Japanese soldiers on the island, the nightmare deepened with each passing week. Cut off from supply lines by American control of the seas, they starved. Diaries recovered after the battle speak of hunger so severe that troops boiled tree roots and grass for sustenance. "We are like shadows," one soldier wrote, "our strength gone before the storm." Disease and exhaustion claimed more lives than bullets. American Marines, too, suffered terribly. The jungle was unforgiving, filled with malaria, heat, and endless mud. Soldiers recalled digging in at night, never knowing if the next charge would break through. Yet unlike their enemies, they were resupplied. Cargo ships unloaded food, ammunition, and reinforcements in quantities Japan could not match. For every plane the Japanese lost, America sent 2 more. For every ship sunk, another was already steaming across the Pacific. The battle raged from August 1942 to February 1943. When it ended, nearly 25,000 Japanese troops were dead. Guadalcanal had claimed its reputation as the Island of Death. For the first time, Japanese forces had been driven from territory they had seized. The myth of their unstoppable advance was gone. Midway and Guadalcanal together marked a turning point. They revealed the cracks in an empire that had mocked American steel as inferior. The United States had proven it could not only resist but strike back, fueled by an industrial engine that Japan could neither equal nor exhaust. The rising sun still flew over vast territories, but its shadow no longer inspired fear. The fractures had appeared, and through them, the relentless power of American industry and resolve began to pour. The road ahead would be long and bloody, but the direction was now unmistakable. The empire was beginning to fall. By 1943, the Pacific War entered a new phase. The United States, buoyed by victories at Midway and Guadalcanal, seized the initiative. Rather than bleed against every Japanese fortress, American strategists adopted a bold idea. Bypass the strongest outposts, strike where the enemy was weakest, and build forward bases to tighten the noose. It became known as island hopping, a campaign that would push American forces thousands of miles across the Pacific, one deadly step at a time. The first great test came at Tarawa in November 1943. For 76 hours, Marines stormed a reef-ringed atoll under withering fire. Machine guns raked the shallows, and men drowned when landing craft snagged on coral. In 3 days, over 1,000 Americans lay dead, and nearly every Japanese defender was annihilated. Survivors recalled the beach littered with wreckage, the air thick with smoke and cordite. It was a brutal lesson. Every inch of sand would be contested at unimaginable cost. From Tarawa, the campaign surged northward. At Saipan in June 1944, the stakes grew higher. This island placed American bombers within range of Tokyo itself. The battle was savage, with Japanese soldiers fighting to the last man. But it was the civilians who bore the deepest scars. Terrified by propaganda that painted Americans as merciless beasts, thousands hurled themselves from cliffs rather than surrender. Marines watched in horror as families vanished into the sea, a grim testament to the psychological war waged alongside the physical one. Behind every advance stood the vast machinery of American industry. Fleets of carriers, built in yards along the west coast, unleashed waves of aircraft that pounded Japanese positions day and night. Factories in the Midwest sent forth bombers by the thousands. B-24 Liberators, B-29 superfortresses, and the workhorse C-47 transports. Convoys of Liberty ships carried tanks, ammunition, and food across oceans, ensuring Marines on the front lines were never abandoned. Japanese defenders felt the weight of this industrial juggernaut. Soldiers described in diaries how artillery rained ceaselessly, battleships shelling islands until they seemed to shake apart. One officer, desperate and exhausted, wrote, "Each time we destroy one, another 10 appear. How can we fight such a war?" The very steel Japan had once mocked now arrived in such endless waves that even victories seemed meaningless. The clash at Polilliu in September 1944 revealed the grinding nature of the advance. Japanese defenders, dug into coral ridges and hidden caves, turned the island into a fortress. Marines and army soldiers fought for over 2 months in searing heat, losing nearly 10,000 men in a campaign that tested the limits of endurance. The battlefield was a vision of hell, shattered palm groves, rocks scorched black, the stench of death hanging in the air. Yet, even here, American industry provided what Japan could not: fresh supplies, reinforcements, and the firepower to eventually crush resistance. Island by island, the Pacific shrank. Each new base brought Japan closer within range of America's bombers. Saipan gave rise to the relentless fire raids on Tokyo. Polilliu secured the flank for the return to the Philippines. Every victory was measured not only in blood but also in steel, poured from factories that never slept. By the end of 1944, the momentum was irreversible. The empire that had stretched across half the Pacific now watched as its outposts fell one after another, severed from supply and pounded into silence. The Japanese warrior code met a foe it could not defeat: the relentless churn of assembly lines, backed by a nation that refused to quit. The stage was set for even bloodier battles ahead, as America closed in on Japan's doorstep. The return to the Philippines was next, and with it, the largest naval battle in history. The island war was far from over, but the path of steel and sacrifice pointed unerringly toward Tokyo. In October 1944, the promise made 2 years earlier in exile was fulfilled. Waiting ashore at Leyte, General Douglas MacArthur declared to the waiting Filipino crowds, "I have returned." The words carried both symbolic weight and strategic importance. For the Philippines had been a linchpin of Japan's southern empire. Its capture by the Allies would sever supply lines and cut Tokyo off from vital oil flowing from the Dutch East Indies. The campaign to retake the islands would prove decisive and unimaginably costly. At sea, the Battle of Leyte Gulf erupted. From October 23rd to 26th, the waters churned with history's largest naval engagement. Hundreds of warships clashed across 4 distinct battles, from the Sibuyan Sea to the Surigao Strait. Japan committed nearly its entire fleet in a desperate gamble to halt the American invasion. Yet the outcome was shattering. By the end, for Japanese carriers, 3 battleships, and more than a dozen cruisers and destroyers lay beneath the waves. American sailors recalled with pride the moment Japanese forces, battered and leaderless, began to retreat. One officer later said it was the first time the Imperial Navy had truly been broken. But Japan answered its defeat with a weapon born of desperation. From airfields in the Philippines, a new tactic took shape: the kamikaze. Young pilots, strapped into fighters loaded with explosives, aimed their aircraft directly at American ships. It was a grim inversion of Bushido, the warrior code twisted into a doctrine of suicide. American sailors watched in horror as planes dove from the sky, engines screaming, smashing into carriers and destroyers with fireballs of fuel and steel. Eyewitness accounts capture both sides of this terrible innovation. U.S. sailors described racing across burning decks, hauling wounded comrades while fire hoses hissed against oil-fed flames. One remembered the sickening thud as a kamikaze struck, followed by silence before the screams. Meanwhile, Japanese diaries reveal pilots writing farewell letters with calm resolve, addressing parents and brothers, convinced their sacrifice might delay defeat. "We go as flowers falling before the storm," one wrote, an image both poetic and tragic. The toll was severe. Dozens of American ships were sunk or crippled, and thousands of sailors perished. Yet, as devastating as these attacks were, they could not alter the war's trajectory. Every ship lost was replaced by American industry in weeks, sometimes days. Carriers launched from West Coast yards arrived faster than kamikazes could destroy them. For every Japanese pilot who died, the United States trained 10 more aviators and launched 10 more aircraft into battle. The fall of the Philippines severed Japan from its southern lifeline. No longer could tankers bring oil from Borneo and Sumatra. No longer could convoys move unchallenged through the South China Sea. The Imperial Navy, already crippled, was left to wither without fuel. Japan had gambled its spirit against America's steel and discovered that spirit, no matter how fierce, could not propel empty engines or supply starving garrisons. The Philippines campaign also revealed the changing character of the war. Japan, once confident and expansive, now embraced strategies of annihilation and suicide. America, meanwhile, advanced methodically, its power drawn not from individual acts of sacrifice, but from an industrial base that seemed limitless. As 1944 ended, the empire that had once swept across Asia was fractured and cornered. Its navy lay shattered, its skies contested, its soldiers increasingly abandoned on isolated islands. Yet its leaders refused surrender. Instead, they turned to ever more desperate measures, vowing to make any invasion of the home islands so costly that America might falter. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa awaited, gateways to Japan itself. And in those crucibles, the world would witness the full measure of sacrifice and the final descent into despair. By 1945, the empire Japan had built through conquest lay in ashes. Once proud warships that had ruled the Pacific were gone, resting on the ocean floor. Cities that had bustled with life, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, were now smoking ruins, their neighborhoods reduced to rubble by wave after wave of American firebombing. Japanese armies, once triumphant across Asia, had been ground down in island jungles and mountain strongholds. Nearly 2.3 million soldiers were dead, and countless civilians shared their fate. Across the Pacific, America, too, had paid a terrible price. The blood of thousands of Marines stained the sands of Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Sailors had fought fire on burning decks, soldiers had advanced through jungles thick with death, and families back home carried the scars of absence and loss. Yet even as the casualty list grew, America's production never faltered. Factories delivered machines on a scale the world had never seen. 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and nearly 3,000 Liberty ships. From the assembly lines of Detroit, the shipyards of California, and the aircraft plants of Kansas and Washington, steel was shaped into an arsenal vast enough to overwhelm entire empires. The ridicule Japan had once voiced, mocking America as a nation of mechanics, dependent on soulless machines, had been transformed into the very engine of victory. Eyewitnesses on both sides left haunting reflections. American GIs recalled the endless march of battles, island after island taken at staggering cost, yet always supplied, always reinforced. One soldier later said it felt as if an entire country stood behind every rifle we carried. Japanese survivors, meanwhile, expressed bitter recognition. Diaries and post-war testimonies admitted that their leaders had gambled on American weakness, a fatal misjudgment. They had believed that material abundance without spirit could not sustain a long war. But as one Japanese officer later confessed, we underestimated the strength of a nation when its people and its machines move as one. By August 1945, the final blows came not by invasion, but from the skies over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bombings ended the war, but the conclusion had been foreshadowed years earlier in the ceaseless rhythm of America's factories. Japan's defeat was written in the hum of rivet guns, the roar of forges, and the silent efficiency of assembly lines. The price of miscalculation was immense. For Japan, it was the collapse of an empire, the loss of millions of lives, and the devastation of its homeland. For America, it was the sacrifice of thousands of young men who crossed oceans to fight on distant shores. Yet the war revealed a truth that would define the modern age. Wars were not won by warriors alone. They were won by nations that could harness both the courage of their people and the industrial power of their machines. As the guns fell silent, America's war machines found their rest. Desert storage yards filled with endless rows of bombers, their wings glinting beneath the sun. Carriers that had once launched waves of planes steamed back to quiet harbors. The factories that had thundered day and night grew silent, their workers returning to civilian life. But the memory remained, of a nation mocked as a land of mechanics that turned steel and resolve into instruments of victory. The legacy of that miscalculation was not only Japan's defeat, but the dawning realization that in the 20th century, industrial power could determine the fate of nations. And in that age, America's mechanics had proven unmatched.